Okay, thanks for joining everybody. This is Jason Warman with PacGenesis. We'll go ahead and get started with today's session. This is session 5 in our series. Today we're going to be covering Aspera Console. Console is a web application from Aspera that covers a few different areas. It's used as a monitoring and configuration management tool. It can be used for real-time monitoring as well as historic monitoring and reporting. There's a reporting engine included. It can also be used to manage transfers themselves. In other words, to remotely initiate transfers in between Aspera nodes. Take a quick look at the agenda for today's session. We've got a few different things around Aspera Console that we'll be covering, the architecture and installation around this, configuring nodes, and a node in this context is really just an Aspera server that we have some sort of access to. There's a few different types of nodes. We'll touch on users and groups within inside of Console, and then look at that real-time and historic monitoring and reporting capability. As I mentioned, there are ways for Console to initiate transfers in between your Aspera nodes. So we'll take a look at those and then cover a little bit of maintenance topics, more on the administrative side for Aspera Console. As always, we're going to reserve some time at the end of today's session for a little bit of Q&A. So if you have questions about anything that comes up during the session, if you could jot those down, and then we'll open it up for questions at the end. All right, let's go ahead and get into it. I'm going to keep this off to the side here so we can stay on track, and then talk a little bit about Aspera Console itself. So like the other Aspera web applications that we've covered so far, Aspera Console is a web app that includes a database, a MySQL database that ships with the software. In this case, the one way that it is a little bit different is that Console itself is not really an end user facing application in the way that fastspec and shares are for folks to directly interact with an Aspera transfer server. Now, that said, you can, as I mentioned, initiate transfers through Console, but it's more of a remote initiation. In other words, Console can be used to kick off a server-to-server transfer, but you can't use Console to upload or download, from your workstation, for example. So let's take a pretty typical kind of deployment. Let's say we've got a few different Aspera transfer servers, and these can be in, let's say, even separate data centers that I have access to. One of these may be front-ended by an Aspera fastspec server. This one maybe is an Aspera shares server. And maybe this one is just used for server-to-server transfers out to the world. On the other end of this, sorry, let me move this up a little bit. Let's say I've got some end users out here on the internet that are talking to fastspec and shares. I've also got this server-to-server workflow where my partners and customers have their own Aspera servers. And these are communicating, let's say, directly this way, right? So we're doing some both inbound and outbound type of traffic from my standalone Aspera server on the end here. Now, this is all very typical. Where Console comes into the play is down here on the inside, where Console, let me switch it over this way, knows about all of your Aspera servers, right? In other words, the 3 Aspera servers in my own data centers, Console is configured to talk to each of these so that we can, monitor everything that's going on and also initiate those server-to-server transfers. In this context, each of these servers, my own servers, are called managed nodes. Console can also be configured to talk directly to your partner's Aspera servers. In that case, these are referred to as unmanaged nodes. The difference here is that my managed nodes, I can see what's going on, I can initiate transfers, I have full administrative access to these managed nodes. My partner's Aspera servers are unmanaged in that I don't have administrative control over here. I just have like a username and password, right? Or a username and SSH key pair. In other words, these unmanaged nodes can be part of a server-to-server transfer that console knows about, but I can't do any administrative functions here. As far as this connectivity goes, there's two different aspects of this. For your managed nodes, console is going to make two connections. It's going to make an SSH connection over TCP 33001 to my managed nodes, and that's really to be able to do things like file browsing over SSH, but also to do configuration changes. So the Aspera.conf file that we've worked with in the past that you can edit directly or edit with the AS configurator command to change the config on your Aspera servers. Console can do that, which it does over a remote SSH session. Console will also make connections over the node API, TCP 9092, to your managed nodes. Now, the node API can be used for initiating those server-to-server transfers, as well as that's where all of the monitoring information comes into play. Right, so all of your server-to-server transfers, all of your inbound and outbound end-user-facing transfers, all of those statistics, both in real time and historically, are pulled in from console over that node API connection. Now, your unmanaged nodes, typically you'll just have one type of endpoint here. Usually it's an SSH endpoint, right? So remember, these unmanaged nodes are connections that your business partners or your customers provide to you to their Aspera servers, and in most cases that's a that's an SSH username password, right? Because you don't have that administrative control over your unmanaged nodes, we're not making that node API connection, right? We don't have those types of credentials generally, so we're just using this as an endpoint to push and pull files back and forth. Okay, a couple of other things I'll just briefly mention here. There is that MySQL database that's included as part of console. So that's included in the installer. That's something that's built in. The MySQL database has the configuration of Aspera console, of course, but this is also where all of the historic information about your transfers that comes over the node API are stored. Right, so in this case, this database can grow quite large depending on the number of servers you're working with and the number of transactions on each of those servers, as well as how much historic retention you want. If you have a lot of volume here, you can think of it as each of these new transfer sessions being at least one row in a database, and then typically more than that to track the transfer over time. So sizing wise, depending on again how much volume we're talking about, this could be fairly significant. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. What I'd like to do is do a basic installation, as we've done in our other sessions for the other Aspera applications. We'll have a single Aspera transfer server that's already up and running. We're going to install console and then make the connection between the two. Okay, let's pull up our SSH session. Center this a little bit. There we go. So I've got my my sandbox server here that I'm going to install console on. There are two different RPM installers here, much like Faspex. So I'll install the common package first. This has the components like Apache and MySQL, and then follow that up with Aspera console. You'll notice here the RPM postscript tells you to run this ASCTL console setup. So let's go ahead and do that. We're going to take the streamlined setup here. The detailed setup will do things like ask for, if you want to run web servers on different ports or something like that, or if you want to have MySQL on a separate box. That is a supported configuration, right? So if you wanted to have sort of a beefy database server that's separate from the web app server, that is supported. If you're running in the cloud, for example, you could also do something like run, let's say in AWS RDS instance, as long as the versions match up for MySQL that supports this under the covers. So there are a few things that we need to provide here. So a username, this is for the initial administrative user for the console web application. I'm going to give this a simple password because it's going to make us change it the first time we log in. MySQL root password. And then you may remember this from our previous session on Fastspec. We also need to let this know what the host name or IP address of the console web app will be, not only for that security validation, but also for the initial SSL certificate, a self-signed SSL cert. So let me give it that. I've got to give it my IP address. And then this last one, IP addresses and host names are allowed to access console. This phrasing is a little bit odd. These are the IP addresses and host names that end users can put into their web browser to access the web application. So this is that host name validation that Fastspec is doing. I put in my FQD in there. You can make that a comma separated list to also include, a IP address, or if there's different internal versus external, you can do that. So the installer is going to go through its thing here and keep running. While this runs, I'm going to flip over to our high-speed transfer server, ASCP-A, always remember that one. This shows me my version and my license information, and get this guy prepped to be able to attach to this Aspera console server. So as I mentioned, console is going to need to make two connections. One's a Node API connection. The other is an SSH connection. You can connect as root, or you can connect as a non-privileged user. Let's go ahead and do that second option. So I'm going to add a user called console_user. We give it a password. Now, in order for console to be able to edit your aspera.conf file, this user would need file system permissions there, right? So I'm going to change the owner to console user of opt_aspera etc aspera.conf, right? That way, this console connection will be able to read and write your aspera.conf file through the web interface. Right. The other thing we need to do is create a Node API user. So let's use our AS Node admin command to add a user. I'm going to call the console Node API user. I'll call this console_node. Give it a password, banana1239. Attach it to my console_user OS user. Just as a reminder here, these first two credentials are for the Node API itself, username and password. The -X is what ties this Node API user to a system user. Now, the last thing that's a little bit different is we need to set a couple of ACLs in this Node API user, since it's a little bit special, right? Console needs some additional privileges. In particular, we need it to be an admin and to be able to impersonate other users. Okay, so I've got my AS Node admin -L. Looks like that's set up fine. I'm going to kick this guy over just to make sure everything looks good. And now this server is going to be ready to be attached to my Aspera console. Okay, the main script has done its thing. You can see all the different options that it's gone through here. It's just setting everything up under the covers and now restarting all of the Aspera console and component processes. Now, the other thing I want to do is go ahead and install my SSL certificate. We can do that with an ASCTL command. ASCTL, if you'll remember, very similar to or the same type of command as we had in the Aspera Fastpecs. This does a lot of administrative functions like doing all colon status. Will show us the status of all the underlying components. Some of these, by the way, these will start up on demand. We'll see that's why some of those say stopped. What I want to do in this case is install SSL cert. I just hit it with a blank argument so you can see the syntax here. Basically, I need to tell it what's my cert file, what's my key file, and then if I have any chain or intermediate certs from my SSL issuer. Okay, so it copied those into the right place for Apache and now just needs to restart the Apache and console processes, which it's doing now. Okay, so we're ready to go. We have everything installed for the base installation. I've got my common package, my console package, ran through the setup script, and now in this case installed my SSL cert. If you don't do this part, of course, it'll just give you the the invalid cert for the self-signed cert in your browser, but you can still continue. Okay, so let's go ahead and hit this thing. I've got my console admin user, and of course I'll have to change this. Current password, new password. Okay, I've got to put in a console license, so let me grab that. Aspera console. Okay, now we're ready to go. This is the basic console interface here. We'll run through all of this in just a bit, but the first thing I want to do is go ahead and attach my node. If I click on the nodes option up here in the top menu bar, I've got a list of my managed nodes, none so far. So let's go ahead and make a connection. All right, so I need an IP address. In this first box, by the way, this does have to be an IP address. If you have multiple servers, and that's actually the wrong address. If you have multiple servers, you'll add them individually here. I'll give it a name. You can see the communications options. These are the default ports, 22, 90, 92. A couple of different options down at the bottom here. Failover. So inside of Aspera console, you can have failover and load balancing groups that are used within Aspera console itself. Where this comes into play is when you initiate transfers, server-to-server transfers through Aspera console. If you have failover and load balance groups set up with 2 or more servers, it will dish out those server-to-server requests among them. And it does actually keep track of which servers are most busy, right? So if you have 2 servers that have access to the same config, of course, same accounts, same backend storage, and want to initiate a bunch of outbound connections from them, every time you do that to the failover group, console will decide which one is least busy and initiate from the other. The other thing down below here is default console groups. So this has to do with permissions inside of Aspera console. So we'll take a look at that a bit, but one thing to note, just in general here, is that there is role-based access control inside of Aspera console, right? So for console user accounts, I'm logged in as an admin, I see everything, but you can give other users less privilege, right? So you can give folks access to only monitor, but not kick off anything or change the config. you can give access for folks to be able to manage just a particular server or set of servers instead of everything across the board. So it is useful in the enterprise from that point of view. All right, let me go ahead and create this, and now we've got to give it our credentials. So the two types of credentials we mentioned, right? SSH, so my console user account, and then my console node account. And click update. Let's go ahead and test the credentials. You'll see up top here, successfully connected to the node via both SSH and the node API. Right, so now I've got, if I click on list manage nodes, my single Aspera node here. You can see the status is active, so I've got no errors on it, and see some basic information, right? It's a Linux server. It's running, or the latest restart of the Aspera Node D service was at 6:34 on 16th of November. Obviously, got to fix my my clocks on my test servers here. Okay, so at this point, I'm going to pull a little switcheroo and flip over to a separate Aspera console server that I configured earlier that has a little bit more going on, so we can see some transfers running and has a couple of additional nodes configured here. This is the same Aspera console version, but let's go ahead and take a deeper look at this pre-configured Aspera console server here. A quick kind of run through of the basic options, and then we'll dive into each of these. So this is the dashboard screen. This is sort of the home screen of Aspera console. You can see I have a list of my currently running transfers. You can look at my scheduled transfers, and we'll get into these details in a bit. I can see any recent transfers, as well as any problems that have come up lately. So this is a good screen to look at to get kind of a quick look at, you know, what's happening right now and what's happened in the recent past on my Aspera servers. You just want a quick health check on what's going on. Now let's flip back over to the nodes tab up top on the menu bar here, because I want to give a little bit more context around this. By the way, you can see other transfers kind of start up and stop as they complete, so that you can see that this dashboard is pretty dynamic. But if I click over back on the nodes, a couple of things to note here. In this case, I've got two managed nodes. In other words, these are Aspera servers that I have administrative control over. These are configured and up and running. You can see they're active. They're both Linux boxes, the restart. And then if I click list unmanaged nodes in the upper right, I've also got an unmanaged node. In this case, I'm using the public demo.asperasoft.com server. So as a reminder, an unmanaged node is one that I don't have administrative control over, but I have a set of credentials to be able to connect into it to upload or download files. So two managed nodes, one unmanaged node configured here. And then the other thing the other concept to introduce here is the notion of an endpoint. An endpoint, and we're talking about console endpoints here, not to be confused with the high-speed transfer endpoint, which is that lightweight server that we touched on in an earlier session. A console endpoint is a set of credentials on one of your nodes. So if I click on edit for this public demo server and then move to the endpoints tab, you'll see I've configured a saved endpoint here. In fact, let me delete this and we'll recreate it. Add endpoint. You can see the endpoint type. You need a login. You can give it an SSH key, or in this case, I just typed in the password because I have it. Email notifications are configurable at the endpoint level as well. So again, remember, An endpoint is a user account on one of your nodes that I'm going to use in order to initiate server-to-server transfers. So the fact that we can put an email notification or multiple email notifications on one of these. And by the way, if I add myself here, you can see the default options here. This means that this email address is going to get a notification when this specific endpoint is involved in a server-to-server transfer. And I can have different user addresses here. In fact, let me add my colleague Scott and say, every time, I don't want anybody to get notified when a transfer starts. I want to know only when a transfer fails. So my email address gets no notification on start or success, only a notification on an error. And I want the reverse for Scott, right? So maybe Scott's more of like a project manager that needs to know that something's successfully completed. So I don't want to bother him with any errors because I need to go in and fix those, but Scott's going to get notifications for successful transfers with this particular endpoint. Okay, go ahead and click create. And now you'll notice again, I've got my saved endpoint for this particular server, and I've got my password saved. So this also goes back to that notion of role-based access control here. So if one of your partners has their own Aspera server, they give you a set of credentials on it, you can save that set of credentials, the username and password, inside of console. So you don't have to give that password, to the 5 different users that may need to kick off uploads to your partner, right? Save it once in Aspera console, and then give those 5 users access to initiate to this endpoint. Right? It also makes changing passwords much easier, right? So if I change it at the OS level, I can change that endpoint once inside of Aspera console instead of having to notify 5 different people, hey, the password for this account's changed. Update your scripts or update your, whatever you're using to initiate those transfers. Okay, so those are the nodes. I've got my unmanaged node with a single endpoint on it. Similarly for my managed nodes, I've got 2 of those. I do have endpoints configured already. I'm looking at my Los Angeles node here. You can see I've got an endpoint. The username is epcon configured already. In this case, it's using an SSH key that I've uploaded here into the Aspera console, which is done here in the configuration tab. A couple of other pieces around your managed nodes, you'll notice that there's quite a few additional tabs on the managed node screen, right? Because I do have full administrative function here. The first one I'll point out is this configuration tab. What this is doing when I click on configuration is making an SSH connection into the server, and it's pulling down a copy of the Aspera.conf file. Right, so things like my bandwidth section, these are all bandwidth options inside of Aspera.conf. You can see I've got a couple explicitly set here over the defaults, right? I've set my upload and download speeds to 500 megabits instead of the default. So I could change this here. In fact, let me bump this up to 600 megabits and set the outgoing to 400 megabits. When I click save, this is doing the inverse, right? This is remotely updating the Aspera.conf file on this particular server. So again, for some use cases, this can be interesting because you don't necessarily need to give SSH access directly to an end user for them to be able to go in and either edit the Aspera.conf manually or run an AS configurator command. They can do it if you grant them access here through the Aspera console. Now, a couple of the areas inside of the Aspera.conf are broken out into separate tabs. In particular, this vlinks section. So you can create vlinks or virtual links here through the web interface. One thing I'll mention about this, the vlinks, as a reminder, are the aggregate bandwidth caps that you can put in for a particular Aspera server, or for even at a more granular level, users on a particular server. One reason vlinks through the Aspera console are a bit easier to deal with is because you can see them visually, of course. So I'm just going to call this vlink number 201, say test, turn it on, and say this is 500 megabits of aggregate aggregate capacity, right? But the thing I wanted to show, you'll notice once I copy this in here, is that you can put in a time varying schedule very easily here through Aspera console. This is a little bit more difficult to do on the command line. You can do it through AS configurator or through managing or manually writing to the Aspera.conf file. But frankly, this is so much easier, right? So I can say this is only weekdays from 8 a.m. To 6 p.m. I want to bump this down, right? 300 megabits. Well, click on that and update. And you'll see it gives you a nice visual representation of this, right? So during weekdays, Monday through Friday, 8 to 6, I've got a 300 megabit limit. Outside of that, all day on weekends and then early morning and the evening, it bumps to 500 megabits. So even if you do most of your configuration directly with AS configurator or on the command line, this is one instance where it really is a nice value add to be able to create these schedules here. Okay, queuing. So queuing will limit transfers, the number of concurrent transfers in or out of a particular node when those transfers are started inside a console. You'll notice the note here, right? So if you're doing direct ASCPs or coming in through a web application, these queues don't take effect. This is just for limiting transfers via console. For a lot of customers that do a high amount of transfer sessions through console, because it is useful for that, this can be a good way to limit that concurrency. Accounts, so this is also looking at your Aspera.conf, but this is a way to edit those sections of the configuration, right? So if I look at my shares user and click on edit, we'll pull up from the Aspera.conf the particulars for that one user. Notably something like the doc root. Where's this user's doc root, as well as any specific parameters that may be different from the global settings server-wide. Okay, I've got my endpoints that we already covered. The map. So there is a default map that you may have noticed on the dashboard view where you can place each of your nodes on the map, right? And by the way, you'll notice when I hover over these, it shows you incoming and outgoing real-time throughput. And on the main dashboard screen, it'll show lines between these as transfers are actually running, right? Now you can customize this map. In fact, for some of our customers that are more concerned about like moving data either in between a country or in between zones, the DMZ versus the internal safe zone versus a red zone or what have you, you can change the bitmap of the map itself to represent this a little bit differently. So that's pretty configurable. A couple of additional tabs. The cleanup tab, this is a little bit old. There's an old SOAP API that console used to use. Everything's done through Node API here, so not much to do. And then if you click on About, this is one thing that's nice for a quick look. This gives you information like the host name, the operating system version, and even the Aspera version of each of your nodes. So if for example, you just want to get a quick look, I've got 10 Aspera servers here in console, and I want to see if any of them are like on an old, outdated Aspera version because there's a bug fix I want to apply. You can, instead of SSHing into each and every one of those, you can just come in here, go to Nodes, About, and take a quick look. Okay, so moving across here up on the top menu bar to the Accounts section, there are a number of options, much like the other Aspera web apps, for user authentication. So you can create users and groups entirely within Aspera console here, so it'll be stored in that local database. You can attach directly to an AD or LDAP server. You can use SAML. So your own SAML IDP for single sign-on. And for, again, most of our customers, you can do a mix and match between these. I'll say Aspera console is a little bit different in that the audience for it is typically smaller, right? These are going to be administrative or operational folks that get this level of access. It's not going to be, like console, or sorry, it's not like shares or fastbacks where you may be opening it up to, dozens or hundreds or thousands of users, both internal and external, to do these transfers. Typically it is more of a small crowd, but they do include the different options here to give you some flexibility on where that authentication is coming from. You'll notice under the Groups tab here, groups are sort of interesting in that you can put some specific parameters around the access control. So this is the easiest way to do that access control for end users coming in through console. These are the three built-in groups. So for all nodes, I've got administrators. They can see and control all transfers on all nodes. Initiators can start transfers on all nodes and only see and control transfers that they themselves have started. So they can't see all of the traffic, just the ones that they've kicked off. And then monitors, these are folks that can see all the transfers on all of the nodes, but they can't initiate anything. So this is good for like that, kind of ops look at what's going on right now. I'm not going to actually kick anything off, but I'm maybe in the NOC and need to keep an eye on things, right? And then you can narrow these down as well. So creating new groups, you can see the different transfer paths here that you can add. This is where you can specify one or more of my endpoints, right? So if I want a group that says I want users in this group, all they can do is manage and monitor and initiate transfers coming out of my LA server. I can say my endpoint 1 is LA server, direction is to anywhere else. And then you'll notice the different options down below. Right, so you can, as you can see here, really narrow down the scope of what users are able to do inside of Aspera console based on these types of permissions. The permissions themselves down below, of course, but also the direction, which servers are going to be involved in that transfer. Okay. Well, let's continue kind of moving through it here, monitoring and reporting. So I touched on the dashboard a little bit. We see some of these transfer sessions running back and forth. As I mentioned, dashboard is kind of that quick, what's going on right now with my Aspera transfers kind of a thing. You'll notice down below, if I click on any of these are all clickable, right? All of these rows are clickable. So if I click on one, I'm actually taken to detail for this particular session, which you'll notice up top here is actually on the activity screen. This is all of the information that's kept for every single session that happens on your Aspera servers. So I've got the session state, it's completed, the file count, 10 of 10 complete, no fails, no skips. I've got my source and destination servers, including the IP addresses. On the right-hand side, you can see the statistics about this particular session. So start time and stop time, right? Those timestamps, how many bytes were written, my average rate. These are all, this is a scheduled session that I have running just to have something to look at. So I made it kind of slow. And then down below here, you can see the specific session files, the files that were part of this transfer session, right? In this case, I've got 10 files and I'm just kind of sending over and over again so that we have something to look at here. But you'll notice that there is an option to search the files. So if I want to search for a particular file name, I can narrow that down like 08, or you can specify errors only. And again, in this case, I've just got the 10 files so I can look at them at a glance, but very often you'll have a transfer session that has thousands of files. This errors only is good to say, how come I had 999 good files and one errored? You can narrow it down easily, and it'll often be something like a permission issue, or if you're searching for a particular file, just to kind of validate that it was part of your set down below. Okay. You'll also notice, I've got my scheduled, my problem transfers down below. You'll see a quick look at the error that we saw. In this case, this server was actually rebooted in the middle of something, and that's why I had a scheduler error. But if I click on this guy, if there is any additional detail, maybe if the errors were at the file level, those will all be displayed on this the screen. Now, the other thing you can do, you can see my scheduled transfer just kicked off here, is you can click on a running transfer and be taken to the activity screen. By the way, you'll notice now that I have this transfer session running, I've got a line between my two nodes that are involved. And if I mouse over, you can see that that bandwidth rate. But if I click on this guy, I'm taken to the activity screen. Now for the activity screen for a running transfer session, it's a little bit different, right? You can see that session state and the file names down below that we've seen before. But up above here, you'll notice we can actually affect this on the fly. So this is running at 12 megabits. If I want to bump this up to say 100 megabits, I can do that on the fly, right? So now I've got a target rate of 100 megabits. This is remotely setting the target rate for this particular session to try to go faster. You can see the graph redraw here, right, as it goes at the higher rate. So this is really useful, particularly in heavy usage scenarios, right? If you've got 10 different transfers running and there's a production issue, right now they're all sharing the bandwidth equally, but there's a production issue, you need to get one of them through faster than the others. You can click on that transfer session like I just did, bump it up to a higher target rate on the fly, and that guy will go at the faster speed. Okay. Okay, so that's kind of the quick dashboard view. As I mentioned, when you click on any of these, you're taken to the activity detail for that session. If you just click activity on its own up top here, you're taken to kind of a bigger look at your recent activity. Now, this is going to show activity by default over the past hour or at max over the past day. So this is my past day's worth of activity. You can see it paginates here. This is good for, again, kind of a quick look at what's happened recently, but also to look at any particular sessions based on the status, right? So if I want to look at errored sessions over the past day, I can click on that. I just had one error. Or if I want to look at everything, but search for a particular username, right? So I only want the sessions that were done by this EPCON user, right? I can narrow it down. Or for a file name start, I want something, I know there was a file or there was a session out there where the file started with UML. Here it is. And again, for each of these, If I click on the detailed, even though this one is in the past, I can see the specifics, right? This was a file, UML, whatever this file name is. Here's all the detail about it. So this activity screen, again, even for up to the past day's worth of jobs, is a good way to kind of see everything. But it is just for the past day. It is more interactive, where I'm going to be manually coming through and maybe searching for a particular file. All of this information, though, all of this metadata about your transfer sessions is kept in that MySQL database, and there is a reporting engine built into Console that lets you report on them. So I've clicked on reports up top here. Here I can manage report types or run a report. Let's first just run a report. There's 15 or 20 or so, whatever this is, built-in reports. If you click on any of these, it's going to give you a little bit of a description of what this is. And these really sort of run the gamut, right? So there are some detailed reports, like this billing report. This is going to see a list of files that were transferred. So this is very detailed, down to the specific file name. There are also roll-up type reports. So let's say I want to look at my bandwidth usage over the past 30 days, inbound and outbound. This is good for planning purposes, right? Am I running into limits? Am I, I have a 1 gigabit Aspera license and I'm hitting that 1 gigabit all the time. Or maybe I've got a couple of servers that have 1 gigabit license, but I'm only using 100 megabits on the time at a time. Maybe I can swap those around to be a little bit more efficient based on your utilization. Let's run of these just to give an idea here. So this is an activity summary by contact. Contact's the username, right, that kicked off the transfer. I can choose my reporting period. So last 24 hours, last week, custom date range. Let's just do the last 24 hours and click Run Report. I'll go through some of these other options in just a second here. You'll see back here on the report request, well, now it just completed, but you can see that report request was submitted, and now here's the detail about it, right? In this case, I've got 2 users in the past 24 hours that have run transfers, my console admin, and then EPCon. You can see the number of sessions inbound, bytes, and average transfer rate, as well as files, any errors, and then the same information on the outbound side. So by this quick look, you can see that console admin had both inbound and outbound transfers. My EPCon user only had inbound transfers. And then some of those details. Now you'll notice that there were a couple of additional options here. If I click on next, now I ran this report on demand, but there is a scheduler built into the reporting engine as well. This is actually pretty useful. What I see a lot here is, let's say, let's run this on a repeating basis every week. Let's say on Mondays at 6 a.m. So every Monday, 6 a.m., repeat it forever, report on last week's data, and then just email me a copy at pacgenesis.com. Right? You can have CSV or Excel format, and you can have as many of these as you like. Genesis.com. So I'll get an Excel copy, Scott's going to get a CSV copy, and when you run this, it'll just be put in. Let me make this in the future here, starting next Monday. This will put this in the scheduler. So you'll notice here, this is scheduled for the first time next Monday at 6 a.m. And then every Monday after that, it'll just continue to run and then email a copy of that report. By the way, I have customers that have these running, on a daily basis or in between days, right? So maybe every 6 hours during the day, they need one of these reports generated because they're going to pull it into a different system or something like that. Okay, so the other option here that I wanted to touch on is that you can create your own reports. You'll notice here on the Manage Report Types page, these are all my built-in reports, and I've got two options in the upper right. Let's start with New Basic. So a basic report is a way to have the system sort of guide you through it. So I'll call this JSON report, little description if you'd like, and then basically walks you through it, right? How would you like to organize this report? I want to organize it based on the server address. Once you choose that first level of organization, and you can have multiple, by the way, let's say server address and contact, right, who the user is. It'll give you a list of the different report columns you can include. There's some basic ones. There's also some advanced ones, things like unadjusted byte numbers. So this is basically, this refers to transfer sessions that happen right at the edge of the reporting period. I'll just stick with basic, right? So let's say I want my server address, I want my contact, my average rate, number of files completed, failed, and you can reorder these by dragging and dropping. There are some sorting options here, right? I'm going to sort by server address ascending, and then by contact ascending. That's fine. You can also put in filters, right? So if I want to say my server address, let's say my source address is not starting with 10 dot, right? I want to exclude some of my particular addresses, or maybe these are my my development servers, 10.100. Let's exclude those from the report. Or if you want to scope it the other way, right? I want only a particular address. You can create that. So pretty powerful, but really basic way of creating your own reports. Now, there is another option you may have noticed there. If I look at my Manage Report Types, there's this advanced option. Now, this is where you can actually get in and start, looking at the actual SQL under the covers, right? So you can create your own very specific reports. Again, give it a report name and a description. If I click on this little help, this actually gives you some real-time help with a few different things, right? So there's a couple of different tables, or these are views actually, right? Files, sessions, files within a session, nodes, all of the different options that you may use, may want to use or pull data from. You can actually create your own temporary tables. And if I scroll up to the top here, the fields reference, so these are all the different columns, and you can see which view or table that these come from. So you can actually do things like joins between these to put some logic in here. Right. So this is a very powerful tool to really narrow down and get very specific information out of the console reporting. One other thing I'll sort of note about this, if I click on reports and look at the completed report that I ran earlier and scroll down, you'll notice I can view the SQL from this guy, right? So this is the SQL that that console is using under the covers. So very useful if you want to make those custom advanced reports, to use this as sort of a starting point, right? You can see the how we're creating a temporary table here, doing some select distincts, and there's even some joins around that, right? So again, good way if there's a built-in report that that kind of gets you started, you can view the SQL of it and use that as the basis of your own advanced report. Okay, so quick look at the reporting functions there. Now, the next big piece that we did want to cover is managing transfers through Aspera console. And there are a couple of different options. So here under the transfer tab, there's a simple transfer and a smart transfer. Now, very briefly, a simple transfer is an ad hoc transfer I'm going to run right now. A smart transfer is a transfer template. Let's start with the simple transfers. I'm going to click on simple transfer and you're taken to the transfer screen. I'll say this is Jason's simple 12. And you can see how it's basically kind of walking you through it. So I need to choose a source server. So let's say my Los Angeles server. You'll notice here, I've got 2 entries for each of these guys. So the first one is the server itself. The second one is one of my saved endpoints. So if I want to source this from my LA server, if I choose the first one, that's the node, I'm prompted for credentials. If I choose the second one, epcon, this is my saved endpoint in the node configuration. So those credentials are already saved in the system. I don't need to provide them. When I click on browse, this is actually doing a remote browse of that server in that user's doc root. So I'm going to say, let me grab, a couple of different files here. These are the 5 files I'm going to transfer. Choose a destination. Let's send these over to the public demo server. You can click on browse. I want this to go in the upload directory. And in fact, I'm going to create a new folder. And again, remember what this is doing. This is a remote view into that endpoint. So this is actually creating Tuesday, a folder on the remote server that's going to be my destination. Right, so you can see on the right-hand side, I've got my source items for my source server, my destination directory on my destination server, and then down below, these are all of the various options around an Aspera transfer, right? So things like how fast is it going to go? 10 megabits? Now let's bump that up to 100 megabits. Should I retry it? What should I do in the case of trying to resume if there is a failure? Or do I want to delete my source files after they successfully transfer? Right, all of these options that you would typically do on the command line, or however you're initiating Aspera transfers, these are available in console as well. By the way, you'll also note you can set email notifications for this one transfer. I've got my default here. This is my own username, but I can add other users. So, if somebody calls me up and says, hey, move these 20 files from this server in LA to our partner server out somewhere, I could say, okay, set up a simple transfer and put in their email address so I don't have to call them back. They'll just get that automatic email that says, hey, these files went through. Now, the other option you'll notice below is by default, this will transfer right now. You can also schedule this for a later time and date. In this case, though, let's just go ahead and kick this off. Again, the simple transfer is a one-time transfer. So you'll see it get submitted, and then this will start running. Here it goes. Right? So this is an ad hoc way to push files in between 2 of my nodes, a managed node and an unmanaged node. Right? Now, the other type of transfer that you can configure here is a smart transfer. Now, again, a smart transfer is sort of like a transfer template. And in fact, I've got one that's you've noticed is running, in this case, every 20 minutes. Let me go ahead and click edit on that one. So I've got my smart transfer. This one's called LA Data File Archive. I have my source. This is my LA endpoint, my source path /dat. I'm saying always transfer the entire directory. This is good for that automated type of transfer. If this is going to be something that an operator runs through manually, you can allow the initiator to select which items from that directory. Now, you'll notice on the Smart Transfer, there's a little diagram on the right. So I have the source highlighted. If I highlight the destination, that'll switch my little option on the left-hand side. So this is my destination server. You can see the path and whether users can change or remove it. Now, by the way, you can also use Smart Transfers for sort of a distribution model. So I can add multiple destinations. So I'm going to say go from LA/dat to this console BK in this archive from LA directory. I can choose another destination, let's say my demo server, push things to my upload directory. Right, and you can see how it's reflected on the little diagram. So by the way, these are two separate transfer sessions, right? There's no real dependencies here. This is just saying every time this guy runs, take this directory in LA, move it to this directory on this console BK server, and also this directory on the public demo server. Now you'll notice down below, I've got the same options like setting the bandwidth, email notifications, and file handling. There is also a scheduling option here. So in this case, I've got this automatically running on a recurring schedule every 20 minutes. Now you can change this to every X number of minutes, hours, days, weeks, months, right? And for obvious reasons here, you can see how this can be useful for a variety of different workflows. So every 20 minutes, this is a good way to do a basic automation in between servers, but maybe every hour, every day, this could be like backing up some specific files that your Aspera servers have access to. And of course, you can create as many of these as you like, all with their own individual parameters. Okay. Now, this Smart Transfer, as I mentioned, is on a schedule. So if I look at my dashboard, kind of coming back to this section we sort of skipped over before scheduled transfers, you'll notice I've got this this scheduled transfer that's always showing up, right? This other one is running right now, but I've got another schedule starting at 11:25, right? In this case, there's actually a pretty small amount of window in between when the previous transfer session ends and the next time it's supposed to be picked up and beginning again. And I sort of did that on purpose just so we'd have something to look at here. But this previous run is finishing, should be around 11:20, and then 5 minutes later, the next instance of this is going to come back up. All right. By the way, the notification section here, I didn't call this out specifically in the agenda, but just to sort of touch on it, because a lot of workflows can take advantage of these notifications. You do have to configure your own email server, of course. There's a couple of different options, like what the time zone is. You can customize all of your email templates. So again, similar to Fastbacks and shares, there's default templates for transfer start, success, and error. You can create as many of these as you like in both plain text and HTML. And then modify these to your needs. In other words, you can have multiple transfer success templates, you know, one for internal use and one for external use, and assign those to different sessions or different endpoints, right? In some cases, you know, you may have a workflow where, you know, somebody, you know, a project manager just needs sort of a high level, hey, this went through, while other workflows may need a more detailed report. You know, maybe it's something that's billable to a customer, so you want to have a more detailed transfer success template that says, okay, here's all of the individual files, or here's a handful of the files, as well as the other information about the transfer session. Now, the other thing I'll mention here is that there is an advanced rule set option around email notifications. This is a way to really zero in and only send email notifications in specific areas, right? So even if I have, if I don't want to send a transfer email notification for every session that comes out of a particular server. I can disable that, but then say, you know, anything that includes a username of Jay Warman, right? And you'll notice it's pretty granular on what you can do, right? Source destination client server, either way, you can negate it or make it true. You can even include things like regular expressions, right? So if you want to build a specific regular expression that matches, you know, a particular file name or file name syntax, which may indicate something that's meaningful for you on the business side, you can set up those specific rules here. Okay, so a couple of things around maintenance. You know, we already mentioned the ASCTL command. That's something that you can use on the command line. Backups are available on the command line, and also here in the configuration section of Aspera console. By the way, you can see all of these defaults. You know, things like looking for free space and timeouts. But here under the database tab, a couple, in fact, these next two options here are kind of covered here. So you can back up the MySQL database. And as I mentioned, this is the database here can grow pretty large, you know, depending on how much transfer activity you have. But I can do a single backup, or I can put this on a schedule, right? So let's say I want to back everything up to /temp, run it, you know, every day at 2 a.m. Repeat forever, right? You can schedule backups this way and then go pick up those backups on the file system. You can also purge data on a scheduled basis. Now, again, because every single session and all of the detail about those sessions are included in your database here, it can grow pretty big. So this may be something where, you know, every week or every month you run a job, let's say on a Sunday at midnight, and purge data that's older than whatever makes sense, you know, that's older than 6 months, or that's older than 24 months. You know, I want to keep the past 2 years of data in my console. You can see also below a couple of different options. You can clear just or purge just particular types of transfers. And you can optionally also save the data that's about to be purged, right? In other words, this is going to do a MySQL export of data that's older than 24 months to a flat file. So you can have that for your archives. And then the live database is just the past 24 months. All right. Finally, we'll just mention briefly the log files. Much like the other Aspera web applications, there are sort of two major sets of log files. They're all in /op/Aspera. For the underlying components like Apache and MySQL, they're going to be in opt/Aspera common. For the console application itself, they're going to be in opt/Aspera console. Okay, well, I know we've gone over a lot today for Aspera console. Thanks for attending with us now. Let's go ahead and open it up for questions.